The most powerful executive in professional basketball didn't lose to a rival league. He didn't lose to a competing network or a hostile takeover from Silicon Valley. He got outmaneuvered by a 22-year-old rookie from Iowa who simply decided she had better things to do. That's not a headline from a sports satire site. That's exactly what happened when the NBA's most ambitious crossover event in recent memory collapsed under the weight of one word: no. For months leading up to the Bay Area All-Star Weekend, the corridors of sports broadcasting were buzzing with a plan so ambitious it almost felt too good to be true. League executives, network partners, and marketing teams had been quietly assembling what they believed would be the single most watched non-playoff basketball event in television history. A four-way three-point shootout featuring Stephen Curry, Klay Thompson, Sabrina Ionescu, and the one name that made every advertising executive's eyes light up like a Christmas tree: Caitlin Clark. The projections were staggering. Internal estimates suggested the event could outdraw actual playoff games. Advertising slots were being pitched at premium rates. Network partners were already drafting promotional campaigns built entirely around the dream matchup. And then, almost overnight, the whole thing came crashing down in a way that nobody inside those boardrooms saw coming. What followed wasn't just a scheduling conflict, it was a full-scale corporate earthquake that exposed exactly how dramatically the balance of power in professional sports had shifted when nobody was paying attention. To understand why this moment hit so hard, you have to go back and look honestly at what was happening inside the NBA's most celebrated annual tradition. For years, All-Star Weekend had been bleeding out slowly, and league executives knew it better than anyone. The ratings told a brutal story. Fans were tuning out in massive numbers, exhausted by exhibition games where nobody played defense, and the competitive stakes felt roughly equivalent to a celebrity charity golf scramble. The energy was gone, the urgency was gone, and in an era where attention is the most valuable currency on earth, losing fan investment during your flagship showcase was a genuinely alarming problem. Television networks were pouring billions into broadcasting rights, while the product they were paying for continued shrinking in cultural relevance. Advertisers started asking uncomfortable questions. Viewership demographics were shifting. The casual sports fan, the person who doesn't follow box scores but will absolutely stop scrolling to watch something genuinely compelling, had completely checked out of the All-Star format. League executives were sitting in crisis meetings, trying to figure out how to inject life back into an event that had become a ghost of its former self. They needed something real, something that felt like it actually mattered, not another manufactured halftime spectacle or celebrity dunk contest. They needed an organic moment of genuine competition that would cut through the noise and remind people why they fell in love with basketball in the first place. And in early 2024, they thought the universe had handed them exactly that. The three-point shootout between Stephen Curry and Sabrina Ionescu became one of those rare sports moments that nobody fully predicted and everybody immediately wanted more of. It worked for reasons that corporate event planners can't manufacture on demand. There was real competitive tension, there was legitimate skill on display at the absolute highest level, and the crossover appeal between the NBA's most beloved shooter and the WNBA's emerging face created a social media firestorm that generated the kind of organic buzz money genuinely cannot buy. Viewership numbers surged. Highlight clips went viral across every platform simultaneously. Sports fans who hadn't engaged with all-star content in years suddenly found themselves watching every shot and arguing about the results with strangers online. For a league desperately searching for that spark, this was the blueprint they had been dreaming about, and the immediate institutional response was completely predictable. If one crossover event could do that much damage to the ratings record books, imagine what 4 elite shooters from both leagues competing simultaneously could accomplish. The math seemed simple. Double the star power, double the crossover appeal, multiply the viewership by a factor that would make network partners weep tears of pure gratitude.
The plan crystallized quickly inside league headquarters. Bring back Curry, add Klay Thompson for the home crowd factor in the Bay Area, keep Ionescu as the proven commodity, and anchor the entire spectacle around the one name that had been breaking every record in sight since the moment she stepped onto a professional court.
Caitlin Clark was the missing piece that transformed a compelling event into a generational television moment. Or at least that was the theory. Behind the scenes, securing Clark's commitment became the single most urgent priority for everyone involved in producing the showcase. This wasn't a casual invitation extended as a courtesy. This was a full-court press involving network executives, league representatives, and marketing teams, all pushing in the same direction simultaneously. The financial incentives being discussed were significant. Promotional guarantees were being offered that would have put her face on every major advertising platform in the country during the lead-up to the event. Prime-time coverage promises were made that most established veterans never receive. Everything about the package was designed to make the decision feel completely automatic. On paper, participating meant sharing a stage with the greatest shooters in the history of the sport, cementing her place in the cultural conversation before her second professional season even began, and reaching a television audience that dwarfed anything that WNBA could generate independently at that point. For a young athlete still in the early stages of building her professional career, the conventional wisdom said this was the kind of opportunity you clear your entire schedule for without hesitation. But the people assembling that package were operating from a seriously outdated playbook. They were running their calculations based on how young athletes used to work, what leverage used to look like, and what the words once-in-a-lifetime opportunity used to mean to someone at the beginning of their career. What they completely failed to account for was that Caitlin Clark wasn't operating by any of those old rules. She had rewritten the rulebook entirely before she ever played her first professional minute, and the executives sitting across the negotiating table hadn't done their homework well enough to realize it. When word quietly leaked that Clark was declining the invitation, the internal reaction inside league offices can only be described as genuine disbelief. The machine wasn't built to process that answer. Industry veterans who had spent decades operating in the world of sports media couldn't construct a logical framework for why a rookie would voluntarily walk away from the biggest promotional platform available to any athlete in the country. The confusion quickly curdled into frustration, and the frustration triggered an aggressive response. High-level phone calls were made, terms were revisited, new proposals were drafted attempting to address whatever objections her camp had raised. The pressure campaign that followed was not subtle. League representatives made it abundantly clear that they viewed her participation as something close to an obligation, a duty owed to the sport, to the fans, and to the broader mission of growing basketball's television footprint. The framing coming out of executive circles suggested declining was somehow an act of professional irresponsibility. What that framing missed entirely was the reality Clark was actually living through. She had just completed one of the most physically and mentally punishing stretches of any athlete's recent career. Her path from college to the pros hadn't included anything resembling a traditional off-season. She had gone straight from the intensity of a deep NCAA tournament run directly into a WNBA rookie season that arrived with expectations no first-year player had ever faced. Every game was a sellout. Every performance was dissected under a national microscope. And on the court itself, she was absorbing hard fouls and intense defensive pressure night after night from veterans who were absolutely not going easy on the new girl, regardless of how many cameras were watching. She was exhausted in ways that don't show up on a spreadsheet. And the last thing a genuinely exhausted athlete wants is to fly across the country to serve as a ratings rescue operation for an event that had nothing to do with her actual competitive goals.
The fallout from her decisions spilled out of the executive suites and into the open media landscape almost immediately, and what followed was a weeks-long national conversation that went far deeper than a simple three-point contest. Sports commentators and analysts began openly questioning whether league executives had fundamentally mishandled the entire negotiation from the very beginning. Some argued that the approach of treating Clark primarily as a commercial draw rather than a serious competitor was inherently disrespectful to her as an athlete. Others pointed to what they saw as a condescending assumption that she would naturally prioritize the NBA's promotional calendar over her own physical recovery and competitive preparation. The debate expanded rapidly. Suddenly, this wasn't just a story about a shooting contest that fell apart. It became a referendum on power, respect, and the relationship between the NBA and the WNBA at an institutional level. Commentators who rarely paid serious attention to women's basketball were suddenly invested in the politics of how the negotiation had been conducted. The story had broken containment completely, and every attempt by league representatives to downplay the significance of the situation only added fuel to an already roaring fire.
To fully appreciate why this moment was so politically charged, you have to understand the environment Clark had been navigating throughout her entire rookie year. Her presence in the WNBA hadn't just been a boost for the league, it had been genuinely transformative in ways that created real friction alongside the celebration. Sellout crowds followed her everywhere. Charter flights, which players had been advocating for years without success, suddenly materialized. Television contracts that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier were signed and celebrated. She was, by any measurable standard, the most impactful first-year player the league had ever seen. But that level of impact doesn't land without turbulence. Veteran players who had spent years grinding in relative obscurity while the sport struggled for mainstream attention watched a rookie instantly receive resources and recognition that the entire league had been fighting for collectively. That created visible tension. Hard fouls that went beyond competitive basketball became a recurring storyline. Post-game press conferences featured subtle shade that anyone paying attention could read clearly. Former legends offered lukewarm assessments of her contributions, while the numbers told a completely different story. Clark was being simultaneously celebrated as the savior of women's basketball and treated with a level of skepticism by certain corners of her own league that would have been remarkable for any athlete to navigate, let alone a rookie in her first professional year. If she had stepped onto the NBA's global stage to compete alongside Steph Curry while appearing to bypass her own league's events and priorities, the internal backlash would have been severe. The optics would have handed her critics exactly the ammunition they were looking for. Stepping back from the circus wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about protecting her standing inside an ecosystem that was still figuring out how to coexist with the phenomenon she had become. Then there's the financial reality that completely reframes the entire negotiation. Caitlin Clark's rookie contract with the Indiana Fever paid her approximately $76,000 for the season. That number is not a typo. While she was personally responsible for generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue through ticket sales, television deals, and merchandise, her actual league salary was the kind of figure that gets lost in the rounding errors of a serious corporate budget. But that number only tells half the story, and the other half is where the real power dynamic becomes crystal clear. Her endorsement portfolio entering the professional ranks was unlike anything a women's basketball player had ever assembled. Nike, Gatorade, State Farm, Wilson, Hy-Vee. The contracts attached to those names were worth tens of millions of dollars, and they were built entirely on the authentic fan loyalty she had cultivated through years of genuine competitive excellence. She didn't need the NBA's promotional infrastructure to reach mass audiences. She was already there. This is the part that the executives pressuring her team completely failed to internalize. The traditional leverage that league organizations use to influence player behavior depends entirely on the player needing what the league controls: exposure, platform, visibility, marketing reach.
When an athlete comes into the professional ranks having already built an independent audience of millions and signed major corporate deals that dwarf anything the league's salary structure could offer, those traditional levers simply don't work. Adam Silver and his negotiating team were running a playbook designed for a world where they held all the cards. In the new landscape Clark had already built for herself, they were holding a hand that was mostly worthless. The NBA needed Caitlin Clark far more than Caitlin Clark needed the NBA, and her refusal to participate stated that reality more clearly than any press release ever could have. The network panic that followed behind closed doors was real and significant. Advertising packages for the Bay Area showcase had been pitched and partially sold around the expectation of a historic four-way crossover event. Media buyers had allocated budgets based on projected viewership numbers that assumed Clark's presence. When those projections suddenly became fiction, uncomfortable conversations started happening between league representatives and their broadcast partners. The three-point contest risked sliding back into exactly the kind of predictable, low-stakes routine that fans had been mentally checking out of for years.
Sports talk shows went into full dissection mode, running the story on a continuous loop and debating every angle with the kind of intensity usually reserved for playoff controversies. Was her absence going to devastate the event's ratings? Had the league overplayed its hand? Was this the beginning of a permanent rift between the NBA and the WNBA's biggest star? The volume of the media coverage itself became part of the story, demonstrating just how thoroughly one person's decision not to participate in a single exhibition event could dominate the national sports conversation for weeks. While the NBA was managing its crisis, an entirely different competitive landscape was quietly emerging that added another dimension to the power shift. The unrivaled 3-on-3 league entered the picture with an offer structure that looked nothing like traditional professional basketball economics. Equity stakes, six-figure salary guarantees for the off-season months that had previously been a financial dead zone for women's players, genuine creative input into how the product was built and marketed. These weren't cosmetic differences. They represented a fundamentally different philosophy about the relationship between a league and its athletes. For the first time, top female basketball talent had genuine alternatives that didn't require accepting whatever terms the established organizations were offering. The NBA's inability to secure Clark's participation wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening in a market where her options were multiplying and her leverage was growing with every passing month. The corporate suits in New York were trying to negotiate in a landscape that had shifted dramatically beneath their feet while they weren't watching. Something else was happening simultaneously that the immediate media coverage mostly missed. Other players were watching, not just in the WNBA, but across professional sports broadly. A rookie had looked the most powerful organization in basketball directly in the eye, declined their biggest offer, and suffered absolutely zero negative consequences. Her brand value didn't drop, her fan base didn't shrink, her endorsement partners didn't get nervous. If anything, the authenticity she demonstrated by prioritizing her own judgment over corporate pressure made her more appealing to the brands that had already invested in her. That's a lesson that travels fast in professional sports locker rooms. The conversation among players shifted noticeably in the months that followed. The old model of deferring to league organizational authority in exchange for platform access started looking increasingly obsolete to a generation of athletes who had watched Clark demonstrate a completely different path, building direct relationships with fans through authentic competition and honest self-presentation, assembling independent commercial partnerships that don't require organizational approval, treating your own career longevity as a non-negotiable priority rather than a variable to be sacrificed for someone else's event calendar. The ripple effects of a single decision not to participate in a Sunday night shooting contest were reshaping how an entire generation of athletes thought about their own power. The dramatic irony embedded in this entire episode is almost too perfect to believe, and it's the part that sports media analysts kept returning to, regardless of which angle they were covering. For years, the standard argument about women's basketball went something like this:
Women's basketball needs the NBA's visibility, resources, and mainstream credibility to break through to casual fans. Women's sports existed in a kind of dependent relationship with their male counterparts, relying on association and proximity to reach audiences that weren't already converted believers. What the Bay Area standoff exposed was that this narrative had quietly flipped completely without anyone officially announcing the change. The NBA wasn't offering Clark a platform out of generosity or collaborative spirit. They were desperately seeking her star power to rescue a format that had lost its ability to generate genuine excitement on its own terms. The organization that women's basketball supposedly needed for mainstream credibility was the one making emergency phone calls and drafting revised proposals, trying to win over a second-year professional athlete. The auxiliary product had become the main attraction. The secondary league had produced the star that the primary league was willing to restructure its showcase around. Every pundit who had spent years explaining why women's basketball needed the NBA's blessing to matter was confronted with a reality that made those arguments look genuinely embarrassing in retrospect.
As the All-Star weekend approached and the final lineups were confirmed without Clark's name attached, the conversation turned to what this moment meant for the future of crossover events in professional sports. The answer, coming from league executives, once they moved past the initial damage control phase, was a grudging acknowledgement that the old approach simply doesn't work anymore. Future negotiations for events like this would have to start from a completely different foundation. Workload management wasn't going to be dismissed as an inconvenient obstacle. Player equity, meaning genuine financial participation in the revenue generated by an athlete's presence, would have to be part of any serious conversation. The timeline between a grueling regular season and requests for additional promotional appearances would need to account for human physical limitations rather than just broadcast calendar requirements. Respect for an athlete's stated priorities would have to replace the assumption that enough money and prestige could override any personal decision. These weren't radical demands. They were basic professional courtesies that the sports entertainment industry had simply never been forced to extend to women athletes because the leverage hadn't existed to require it. Clark changed that calculation permanently. What Caitlin Clark pulled off during that stretch wasn't just impressive from a personal career management perspective, it was structurally significant in ways that will continue echoing through professional sports for years to come. She demonstrated that in the current media environment, where fans follow individual personalities across platforms with a loyalty that legacy organizations cannot manufacture or control, the traditional levers of institutional power have a ceiling on their effectiveness. You cannot pressure someone into compliance when they don't need what you're offering. You cannot manufacture urgency around a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for someone who is already living the life that opportunity was supposed to unlock. And you cannot maintain the fiction that women's sports exist as a supporting feature in the NBA's content ecosystem when the numbers tell a completely different story every single night of the regular season. She understood her own value with a clarity that caught an entire industry off guard. She understood the long game when the people across the table were playing for a single Sunday night rating spike. She protected her body, her competitive focus, and her career trajectory when the pressure to sacrifice all three for someone else's benefit was coming from every direction simultaneously. And in doing so, she drew a line in the sand that the entire professional sports landscape is still reckoning with. The balance of power in basketball didn't shift gradually or politely, it shifted all at once, announced by the silence of one name missing from an event roster and the deafening conversation that silence created. The era of dictating terms to elite athletes based on who used to hold the power is finished. The question now is how quickly the organizations that built their entire operational model around that old dynamic can adapt to the world that already exists. Because whether they're ready or not, Caitlin Clark already moved on.